everyone and welcome to the Bolsover Round-Up video. I had fun with this district. It was a tough one to do in places. It's quite hilly, very lengthy from north to south, and some of the places in it are massive. Despite that, it's full of interesting stuff that isn't limited to just the various collieries that we've seen in and around these 16 parishes of eastern Derbyshire. Here's what you guys, the Bolsover locals, sent me about them all. In alphabetical order, as usual, we start with Old Hucknall. Doley did have a school, as I thought, but it burnt down. The pupils then attended Stainsby School. On the drive from Old Hucknall to Stainsby, you pass the scene of an unsolved murder from 1970. Barbara Mayo was murdered at the top of Hodmire Hill, and this remains unsolved. Astwith is not a dead-end village as stated in the video. You can actually drive through it and down close to the M1. The chapel in Hardstoft has been allowed by the National Trust to go into disrepair, and it was currently for sale at the time of making this video, but I've recently learned that it was auctioned off for £163,000. The bidding was fierce, from a guide price of £60,000. Moving on to Barlborough, and nobody sent me any information about this one, so let's move on to Blackwell. Blackwell, and Percy Topliss was a famous resident with connections to the local mining industry. Topliss, better known as the monocled mutineer, was a bit of a local celebrity for being an imposter, claiming to be an army officer, mutineer and deserter, and a criminal. With that fairly long list of wrongdoings, it's clear that Topliss was what Derbyshire people like to call a wrong'un. It's not known how real the character created by the media at the time, who viewed him as Britain's most wanted man, actually was. It's clear, though, he was a troubled soul from an early age. Moving on to Clowne, and again we have no information for this, so it's time to move on to Elmton with Creswell. The first thing to note about Creswell is the pronunciation of its name. I have always called it Creswell, but apparently you locals call it Creswell, and I did allude to this in the Clowne episode. In Creswell churchyard there's a man called Reginald Hardwick buried, a man that survived the sinking of the Titanic. If you look to the right entering the churchyard, there are the graves of some of the 80 miners killed in the disaster mentioned in the video. Most of their widows lay there with them. Next is Glapwell. The Plug and Feathers has recently closed and looks set to become a Costa. The pub has struggled for a fair few years though, despite the houses around it and the very busy road it lies upon. The land in Park Avenue's controversial sale is the only asset of community value in the whole of Bolsover district. This is where the Glapwell Carnival Parade would pass through the village. Residents are angry because the developer could have taken a different route. The meeting referenced was a Bolsover District Council meeting, not just a Glapwell Parish Council meeting. Glapwell also had a shop called Mrs. Ward's, and it was located halfway down the hill. This was gone by the mid-1970s. On the subject of shops, despite one resident telling me otherwise, Glapwell does actually have a shop, which also contains the post office. If you carry on walking around the green past the surgery, you see it there. It used to be a co-op in the 1970s. Down Rowthorne Lane on the left is an old post box, as the street is where the old post office was. Next door used to be a shop and a hairdresser's. Now to Hodthorpe and Belph. The garden beside the plant is a community garden for use by various community groups by appointment. First, Whitwell Scouts have an ongoing programme of activities there to help set up paths, clear trees and build wildlife habitats. Here's a minor correction from the video. Station Road is not the A60, it leads to the A60. The access road to Belph and the cottages and the former pub are all on that road. The warning signs that I asked about next to the school are where Welbeck Estate plan to build a number of houses. The parishes of Whitwell and Hodthorpe and Belph separated in 2012. Now, there was lots for Langwith, including a memorial to a munitions factory explosion and a 1942 plane crash, which were not featured in the video. As well as the cave featured, there's also a cave just up from the ponds on Poulter Park in the woods. Langwith Basset Cave is known to most locals as Gildy Cave or Gildy Wells Cave, thanks to Gildwell's farm being located on the road to Bolsover from Upper Langwith. The village hall in Langwith used to be the village junior school, with the building directly behind it being the infant school. Langwith Basset is mainly Upper Langwith. The area was once owned by the Basset family that owned the land and a manor house called Basset Castle. It's sometimes called Basset Hall on pre-1900 maps. Next is Old Bolsover, and I received a lot of compliments about the day I picked to film this one on, thanks to the amazing views across Derbyshire. Here's what you sent me about Old Bolsover. The Adult Education Centre used to be the junior school or national school. It was originally a dame school, and part of the castle's grass was used by the school as a playing field. One thing I did not feature here was Carr Vale and the accompanying nature reserve, which lies to the southwest of the town. Hillstown was named after the Reverend Hills, who was instrumental in the houses being built here, and the streets Nesbitt, Selwyn and Victoria were named after his children. Langwith Road used to be called Gander Lane, and Scarcliffe Parish ends on the white line in the centre of Langwith Road in Hillstown, as across the street they don't pay the additional parish tax. Just the one piece of information for Pinxton. A local informed me after releasing this video that the John King Museum has been closed for a number of years and is now purely a scout hut. That's a real loss for the area. Moving on to Pleasley. The road to the mill buildings is actually a public right-of-way. The barrier has an intercom you can use to be let through. The walk through the Vale is lovely at any time of year. It's bounded to the north by Pleasley Park Woods, an ancient woodland granted park status by Edward I back in the 11th century. St Chad's Church is just over the border into Mansfield and is linked historically with the mills and its previous owners. It used to stand on the other side of the river originally, and Joseph Paget, who owned the mills, had it dismantled piece by piece and rebuilt on the other side. New Houghton is usually pronounced New Uffen by the locals. The font outside St Michael's is from the old Christ Church at New Uffen, making it Victorian. The 1662 font mentioned is inside at the back, and the old Norman font is in the chancel. On Meaden Square there's a community orchard which has fruit trees, vegetables and seating areas, and some honeybees. All fruit and veg are free for anyone to pick when they're ready. The honey from the bees is sold to help raise money for the upkeep of the orchard. On Pit Lane off Chesterfield Road there's a former Wesleyan Methodist chapel, and you're able to see the old steps that lead up to Pleasley West railway station. Moving on to Scarcliffe. Between Scarcliffe and Palterton, you pass a memorial to 3 of the 7 crew of a Royal Canadian Air Force Halifax bomber that crashed in March 1944. Ryler Road is everyone's favourite rat run to the M1. This is the dangerous hill featured in the village. There's also something called the Scarcliffe Soapbox Derby, and I've included a link in the description so you can have a look at that. The Palterton Festival takes place between the 12th and the 25th of July every year. As I thought, Palterton Village Hall was indeed the former miners' welfare. Graham Riley was a well-loved character, often found standing at the bar in both Palterton and in places in Bolsover. Palterton is the home of Stephen Blakely, who played PC Younger in Heartbeat. Next is Shirebrook. The farm park used to be a school. It was called the Lower Comp, which children attended for 2 years before then transferring to the Higher Comp, which is now Shirebrook Academy. The Lower Comp closed in the late 1980s. Where the leisure centre is was one of the highest railway bankings in the country that ran from Langwith Junction to Shirebrook South Station as the Lean Valley Extension. It was built by the Great Northern Railway in 1901. The stone building mentioned in the video was a pub, the Great Northern. Now it's time for South Normanton, and rather unforgivably, there's a typo in the opening screen. The postcode should say DE55 as opposed to D355. That is an error purely on my part. The framework shown on the South Normanton Parish Council logo is that of the post windmill that once stood in the village. It was dismantled and put into storage in 1980, but sadly rotted away and is no more. Next is Tibshelf. Tibshelf tornado was in 1952 on May the 19th. My original source incorrectly stated the 1980s. Tibshelf ponds were formed as a result of pumping water out of the colliery. Tibshelf town station was in the second, more northerly area which I identified. The first area, the wide one involving the canter track, was the site of a goods yard, associated railway tracks and a goods shed. The area next to Newton and Tibshelf station used to be a scrapyard. There are several buildings in Tibshelf which are no longer used as they once were. Opposite the new co-op was an abattoir, and opposite the Twisted Oak and the Crown was a bookmaker's. There are some new houses on Brook Street which were originally Brookie Club, and the travel shop between the Wheatsheaf and the co-op was Croft's Chemist. There was also an old doctor's surgery opposite the garage, and the new houses next to it used to be a shop. Finally, next to the chippy used to be a second-hand and antique shop. And lastly, it's Whitwell. There's some lovely views at the bottom of and halfway up Hillside. There's an ROC post and the sadly broken and destroyed trig point near it in a field to the north of the village. The Boot and Shoe is now closed and will become flats shortly. There's a link in the description for some more information on Whitwell well dressing for anyone who's curious. Roger Manners lived at the Hall. The manor is a completely different building, but easily confusing as they both held manors in Whitwell, and the old hall used to house the manor rooms. On Portland Street towards the Methodist Church, you walk past another ex-pub called the Jug and Glass, just a few yards from the home of an ex-Sheffield Steelers netminder, Jeff Woolhouse. And that brings the district of Bolsover in Derbyshire to a complete close. Thank you everybody that sent me all that amazing information to make this very roundup video. Don't forget, I still have plenty of Derbyshire to go to on the channel, so if you're new around here, click the subscribe button and follow me on my future adventures. But for now, this has been the district of Bolsover, and I've been Andy, otherwise known as the Village Idiot, and I'm out.